Good afternoon. Now I can start. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Thank you to the Begin Center for hosting this event, to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, who along with NGO Monitor is co-sponsoring it, President Ambassador Dore Gold, to our panelists, to Miri Eisin, I'll introduce everybody separately, and most importantly, to Colonel Richard Kemp for being here. I don't mean being here just now at 10 minutes after 5, Jewish Standard Time, not bad, in the Begin Center for this important discussion, but for being here in Israel. For being in Israel many times when we need him. Even before we know that we need him, he's often here. According to the media, if you pick up or look at the newspaper, television, radio, we're in the 7th day of something called Operation Protective Edge. But let's face it, 17th day. Did I say year? You see that? No, 17th. Richard, that's it. You're out. But this is for most of us not our first war, or second, or our third, or our fourth. It might be the 66th year since 1948, or we can go back decades before that. In the book of the Judges, we go through something like 400 years before we have a short period of stability, before the kingdom is united and established, and Jerusalem is established as its eternal capital by King David. So in biblical terms, in historic terms, it's a long war. It's a long war both because of the casualties. 2,000 rockets have been fired. The number is staggering from Gaza, which is supposed to be one of the most poorest places in desperate need of humanitarian aid, that needed desperately to get cement so they could build houses and schools and mosques and tunnels, yes, and tunnels, exactly. And in parallel to this political war, to this physical war, to this military war, which is taking a very high cost to Israelis, every single person that's killed is a high cost. There's a whole world to themselves. But we're also used to the fact that there's a parallel political war that's going on, using the deadliest weapons of the 21st century, blatant lies. Richard Landis is here. Did you invent the word Pallywood? I think so. Pallywood. The staging of events, primarily of what looks like brutal killings of Palestinians, Palestinian children in particular. The Mohammed al-Dura case is the most obvious one. Something called photography, not P-H-O, but F-A-U-T-O, photography, false images which are manipulated and maneuvered, all of which to create accusations of Israeli war crimes, of violations of international law. We hear this language every day in every possible media. Where standards, we've heard the term double standards, but these are really unique standards that are applied to Israel, not applied to anywhere else in the world. Collective punishment is a term that's very frequently used about Israeli relations with Gaza over the last 10, 15 years. And if you look for collective punishment in organizations like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, to see in their thousands of pages and hundreds of reports and press statements where they use it, they almost use it no place else in the world. There are at least a dozen active conflict zones. There are blockades and limitations, and it's very much it's actually part of a nonviolent way of dealing with threats to try to prevent those weapons from getting in to places like Gaza that are run by terrorist organizations. But only Israel gets the term collective punishment, with its echoes of the Nazi treatment of partisans and those who would attack Nazi officials in Europe, but that term collective punishment, just like the entire apparatus of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, is now being applied to Israel in this dirty political war. And yesterday we got a very strong reminder of that. The United Nations Human Rights Council met. It kind of reminds me actually of the wise men of Kemp, who sit and deliberate. Okay, I'm getting a little addition to that. Who deliberate over absurd issues. UN Human Rights Council certainly would be very good parallel to that, perhaps outdoing them. And if you listen to speaker after speaker, with the exception of the Israeli delegate and my colleague Hillel Neuer and a couple of others, NGOs, who spoke there, in one of his presentations, UN Watch spoke on behalf of the NGO Monitor, the Amutah for NGO Responsibility, as the ECOSOC accredited organization in Geneva. But 30 or 40 other speakers, almost all except the United States and a couple of other representatives, the Australian representative, the Canadian, used that language over and over again. War crimes, the atrocious cost to Palestinians in terms of civilian deaths, all the terrible things. And we even hear it now in Jerusalem today. The British Foreign Secretary, Israel has the right to defend its citizens, but we always get this but afterwards. But we have to take care not to harm civilians in Gaza. Of course that's true. But the way it's said and used is very much part of the political war. They adopted a resolution to establish an investigation, what we've called Goldstone 2. In an NGO Monitor's report that we've released this afternoon, we document the constant hammering of these issues by almost the same NGOs, 30 NGOs, probably 100 statements that have been issued in the last 17 days or a little bit longer, condemning Israel with allegations of war crimes, all the language that we've heard many times. First time Goldstone report was a tragedy. It was a tragedy, perhaps most of all, for Judge Richard Goldstone, who only a year after accepting this position to run a kangaroo court, recognized that he didn't know, and his commission didn't know, and all the NGOs that were quoted in that 500-page report that was issued by the United Nations under his name had no idea what they were talking about. It was all slogans and lies and pallywood. It was all one-sided, double standard, or unique standards. The organizations that were involved then don't seem to have learned anything. B'Tselem, an Israeli organization, often said the most credible Israeli human rights organization. Not saying very much, unfortunately. B'Tselem is now part of a group, a protection cluster, it's called, which officially provides casualty information to the United Nations, which then provides it to all the journalists and all the diplomats. B'Tselem gets its information in coordination with the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, an NGO whose activities are almost entirely aligned with the Hamas leadership. And if you look at their website and their publications, it's the same language. The Israeli occupation forces are guilty of war crimes. And Al-Mazan, another Gaza-based organization, all are funded by European governments. Those are the three organizations that form the protection cluster. And I can assure you that none of them have any idea how many Palestinian civilians have been killed in Gaza, how many Palestinian casualties they are, and who's a civilian and who's a combatant. Those are not trivial issues, and there's no way that anybody from B'Tselem, an Israeli-based organization, could possibly have any reliable information. They certainly did not back in 2009 when they issued the same kind of statistics during the original, the first, what was called CAS-led, the first, what I call the first Gaza war. This is the big Gaza war, I think. And on and on. These are very much part of the political war. And we have to know, and I think we're learning slowly as Israelis, how to deal with this. I think the rest of the world has a long way to go. When the European governments yesterday abstained, the speeches were great, but then they said at the end, and therefore we're going to abstain from this absurd, that's my word, resolution to create another investigation of Israel allegations against Israeli war crimes. There are some Europeans who get it. I'm not sure I should call a British colonel a European, but I'll take that risk. Our first speaker today is Colonel Richard Kemp. Now, I know that most of you know who he is. You've seen him on television here in the last few days, and you know his heroism, not just his heroism as a soldier, as the head of the International Terrorism and Iraq team in the UK, chairman of the COBRA Intelligence Group, his responsibilities, particularly in Iraq, head of the forces there, his experience, the work that he did in investigating the July 2005 London bombings. Colonel Kemp is well known and well respected for all of these. But I think most importantly, he's well known and well respected among us because he dares speak truth to power. He knows, and he said to the Goldstone Committee, to Judge Goldstone, you're wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. You have no military experience. You can't possibly know what goes on in these situations. Unfortunately, Judge Goldstone and this committee decided not to report Colonel Kemp's testimony and experience and capabilities. We have the honor and the privilege of being able to hear what they held their ears to. And I thank you very much, Colonel Kemp, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Gerald. It's a real honor to be here and to be invited here to speak in this great city at this time, at this historic time, I think. And I'd just like to start off by saying, I think as a former soldier, it would be wrong not to make mention of the remarkable sacrifices that have been made by your soldiers, my allies, fighting in Gaza, particularly those who have made the ultimate sacrifice over the course of the last week. And each and every one of those young men, in fighting and dying for their country, have given more than any other citizen of this country could ever give to their country, and made a much greater contribution than any of us could ever make. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm first of all going to start off by talking about my favorite subject, which is myself. I've received 4 honors, 4 really significant honors in my lifetime. I want to take you through each and every one of them, because it's important that you know how great I am. The first honor, the first of the 4 honors, I received from a lady ambassadoress in the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva in 2009. And I gave the testimony that Gerald mentioned, and afterwards, after the session was finished, my testimony was right towards the end. After the session was finished, this lady ambassadoress came up to me and said, she was an ambassador of I'm not sure what country it was, but it was an African country or Middle Eastern country, I forget. She came up to me and said, Colonel Kemp, for the lies that you have told this august body today, your soul will burn in hell for all eternity. For me, a great, great honor to hear those words. The second honor I received was slightly more obscure, I think, for this audience, but I'll tell you anyway. Have you heard of a gentleman, a very distinguished British politician and former activist in various areas by the name of Gerry Adams? Yes? Once upon a time head of the IRA and now, as I say, very respected politician. And I once wrote an article in a newspaper in England in which I said that I pointed out that the IRA had been defeated by the British Army and particularly by British intelligence. And of course that is not what you say, because they came to the table and we all love each other now. But he wrote an article the next day, a full article the next day, saying a number of things, but one of the things he said was, it's not surprising that the British Army is so atrocious if they've got colonels as stupid as Colonel Kemp among them. Again, a dramatic honour for me. And the third honour was I received about 6 to 8 months ago, when I got a late night phone call from the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, who told me that they had gained information that my name had appeared on a death list of the group Al-Shabaab, which is, of course, as you know, is part of Al-Qaeda, which carried out those attacks in Kenya. And again, that huge privilege for me to be on their death list, because if I'm doing something that they don't like, then it clearly is the right thing. And the final honour, more recently, which I may share with some of you, is that since I've been here, Hamas have made numerous attempts on my life. I have been in Tel Aviv, I've been down in Beersheba, I've been in Sderot. They keep firing rockets at me. Can I just want to run through a few topics, and Gerald, if you wouldn't mind coughing discreetly when you think I've spoken enough, because I do tend to like the sound of my own voice. The first one is the current situation here and how people perceive it, and how people, we've already heard that the British Foreign Secretary, who I bumped into yesterday in the King David Hotel, he didn't seem that pleased to see me, I don't know why, but the British Foreign Secretary says, yes, we blah, 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 but Israel must take more care in avoiding civilian casualties. And people like President Obama and David Cameron, everyone says that. They all urge Israel to take more care. But the question I would ask them is, well, tell us what? Tell Israel, tell Prime Minister Netanyahu what more he should do to take greater care of the civilian people. Because the answer would be, oh, I don't know, because they don't know, because there is nothing further. I was in the army for 30 years in the British Army. I fought this kind of conflict for 30 years, pretty much all of the time, in various different places. Northern Ireland, very different but similar kind of challenges. Afghanistan, Iraq, and to an extent the Balkans. And I don't think there's anything that I can think of that Israel is not doing now to preserve civilian life, except sitting back and just taking it. And of course, that's what many people think you should be doing. But if you look at what Britain did, Britain got a few missile attacks, a few rocket attacks, hurled at it. And we'll look at what Britain's response was. It was in 1943, and British intelligence found out that the Germans were developing a new missile system which was capable of reaching southern England, fired from the French coast. And the intelligence worked out, recognized where the workshops were and the development plants and the scientists for it. And what did they do when they realized this was a potential threat? There was no rockets landing, but it was a potential threat. Did they perhaps go to try and find someone to negotiate with the Germans and sort of say it's not a good idea to do this, rather you didn't? Or did they go and drop a load of leaflets on the place and say, stop doing it or we will bomb you? No, they didn't. They sent a 600-bomber raid to Peenemünde, which was the city where this was taking place, and they obliterated it. They obliterated it. They did not think about civilian casualties because they were in a battle, effectively a battle for survival. Civilian casualties were not on their list. 723 civilians were killed in that one raid. 723 innocent civilians were killed in that one raid. And the next thing that happened, because that did not, unfortunately, did not end the project, the Germans were resilient, they relocated it, and they then started launching missiles from missile launch sites on the coast of France. And in the first few months of 1944, when this began, the Royal Air Force dropped 2,000 tons of explosives onto those sites. That's our response, and that would be our response. I have no doubt that would be our response today, something similar to that. And there are comparisons between these operations. I mean, the V-1 rocket, also known as the buzz bomb or the doodle bomb, it had a much more sophisticated guidance system than Hamas's rockets do now, but it was pretty much the same. It was basically pointed in the direction of southern England. They worked out how to get it to go to a certain distance, which was to hit certain key population centres, and they were pretty successful. A lot of them failed, but they were pretty successful. But they were pretty basic, rudimentary things, like they had more explosive power than most of the Hamas rockets have. But the Nazis, at the height of that campaign in 1944, only managed to send 100 rockets into Britain every day, whereas, of course, we know Hamas, their daily average since the beginning of this campaign has been 130. So they've beaten the Germans in dumping rockets into here, or attempting to. I just thought I'd mention that because a lot of the time you hear people saying, what would you do? Well, that was what we did. The next thing I just want to mention is the disgusting spectacle yesterday in the UN Human Rights Council. Absolutely, I mean, I read the resolution. It's shocking. It's not shocking. It's not surprising, of course, from that body, but it is disgraceful. And the thing I find most worrying about it is the abstentions of my own country, in particular, when you've got the Prime Minister standing up saying, yes, Israel deserves to defend itself and should be defending itself. But on the other hand, his ambassador in the EU, in the UN Human Rights Council, is not backing that up. He's abstaining. Now, it doesn't make any difference whether he's voted against the proposal or abstained. The result would have been the same. The proposal would have gone through. But it's a moral issue, and he failed to meet, I think, reasonable moral standards, as did the other EU countries. I was talking to Hillel Neuer, who was mentioned just now, talking to him this afternoon about this, and he made the point that it's expected. I said to him, why do the EU countries abstain as opposed to voting against the resolution? And he said that's the wrong question. The question is, why did they abstain as opposed to voting for the resolution? Because everyone else is asking him that question. That's what most people perhaps think should have happened. And he made the point, of course, that there is such a wide variety of views in the EU. There are countries, certain countries, very, very, very anti-Israel. Some countries very reasonably, I was going to say very pro-Israel, but I can't think of one particularly. Czechoslovakia, yeah, he said that as well. And then a few sort of in-betweeners, like apparently Britain. And so it's getting, and they like to vote together. They don't have the guts to vote on their own. They like to vote together. So that was why they got to that consensus. But it is shocking and disgraceful, but not surprising. The Goldstone report itself, I just wanted to make a point about Goldstone because I don't think it can be said often enough, which is that to a large extent, the contents of the Goldstone report was influenced by a gentleman by the name of Colonel Desmond Travers. You may or may not have heard the name. He was Goldstone's military advisor. Desmond Travers was a colonel in the Irish army. Yes, they do have an army. And the Irish, are there any Irish people here? I should ask that question. So I'm going to insult you, so I apologise in advance. Southern Irish. So, I won't, no. I'm not going to insult you, but no, the Irish have an army, but and Colonel Travers was the representative of the, was retired from the Irish army. And he was the man who gave the expertise on this, the military aspects of this operation, which is the main aspect, particularly the air. Air was very significant. The Irish army has never fought a war in its entire history, not one. And the Irish forces do not have an air force, or they do have an air force, but it has just 2 or 3 helicopters which transport generals around the place. So he's never therefore commanded forces and planned operations. He's taken part in a number of peacekeeping operations, but he didn't have the expertise. And when he was asked, for example, in an interview, why you said in the report that Hamas did not conceal weapons in a mosque. They didn't use mosques to conceal weapons. And he said, no, that's absolutely right. I guarantee it didn't happen. And the interviewer said, well, what's your evidence? And he said, well, I wouldn't do it. And that was it. It was, oh, it doesn't make sense. It's illogical. I wouldn't. Why would we do it? And of course, in the British forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, frequently mosques were used to store weapons and to attack soldiers from. Anyway, I just thought I'd say that because I do like to run down Colonel Travis whenever I can. I will go through just a few other points, if I may. First of all, this issue of war crimes, which has been raised in the United Nations Human Rights Council and is often spoken about, accusations made in the media, etc. You have read them more than I have. In relation to Israel, I think there are 2 issues. The first one is that the government of Israel does not just have a right to defend its population from these forms of assault. It has an absolute obligation to do so. It's not a choice. It isn't a choice that the Prime Minister makes, just gets up in the morning and decides he's going to do that. He's got no option, and if he didn't do it, he wouldn't be Prime Minister much longer. And the country would, if the country as a whole refused to engage like that, it would just disintegrate, as any country would. The next point on Israeli war crimes is the question of the targets being hit, and it's a question of there are 2 relevant legal points here. I'm not going to go into great legal detail because I'm incapable of that anyway. But the first one is military necessity. The targets that are being hit by Israeli air, or in fact now on the ground by tanks, by artillery, by infantry soldiers, the targets being hit. To make that legal, it must be necessary to hit those targets if there is a possibility of civilians being present in the vicinity of them and civilians being killed or wounded. You cannot lawfully attack a target if there are civilians there unless it's necessary to do so. There are obviously military targets and it's not necessary to do it, but there's got to be a question of necessity. Rocket launchers that are sending missiles into your civilian population, command centers that are controlling it, terrorists who are running around the place organizing it, these are all, and munition stores and so on, these are all necessary targets. There's no question about it. No one would possibly, well, I'm sure some people would disagree, but no sensible person would disagree. So that requirement of necessity, I think, is pretty plain. The second requirement is proportionality. Now, the global media believe, as many politicians I've heard speaking, believe that proportionality means that Israel has taken, what's the current civilian death rate in? 3, okay. Israel has taken has had 3 deaths. And in Gaza, there is an unknown number of deaths, 700 or something, but some of them obviously some of them are civilians, we don't know how many. So 700 deaths and 3 deaths. That's disproportionate, grossly disproportionate. Therefore, it must be a war crime. But the concept of proportionality is not related in any way to relative casualty rates. It's irrelevant, completely irrelevant. Proportionality means in military law, in the law of armed conflict, it means, and it refers again to a target that has the potential for civilians to be hit. There's no question of proportionality if there's no civilians around. If there's a rocket launcher there and no civilians near it, and you want to drop 2,000 tons of explosives on it, fill your boots. It's not illegal. If, on the other hand, there's a possibility that civilians will be killed, then you have to decide on proportionality, and that's a decision taken by a military commander. And the decision is, there is a chance that if I hit that rocket launcher, then 3 civilians will die. And I've got to assume they will, if I hit that rocket launcher. Okay, so and what happens if I don't hit that rocket launcher? Well, that rocket will be launched, and it will go into Tel Aviv, or it will go into Sderot. And it will be intercepted by an Iron Dome and shot down. And anyway, the early warning system will go off, and the population will be in their shelter, so there won't be any problem. So it's disproportionate because I kill 3 people, whereas if it had fired, no one's dead. But that's obviously wrong, because what you have to look at is the potential of that system and the reality of the world. So you have to make the assumption that if that's fired, it will not be intercepted by Iron Dome, because, of course, Iron Dome is not perfect any more than anything else is. The early warning systems won't work, or people won't get to the shelters on time or whatever, and therefore you make the assumption that missile could well end up in a schoolroom and kill 20 children. So these aren't exact figures, of course, but so, you know, in fact, if it was only 1 person it killed, you would still say proportionality, that rocket kills 1 person, it's proportionate to kill those 3 people. It's not disproportionate, because it's not a science. This is very blurred. It's a commander's decision. Some things are obvious. You've got a ration truck full of food. That's a legitimate military target. There are 10 civilians around it. There are 100 civilians around it. If I hit that ration truck, 100 civilians are going to die. If I don't hit that ration truck, then people are going to have their food. That's the consequence. So it would be disproportionate to hit that ration truck, quite clearly. That's what it means, ladies and gentlemen. That's proportionality as a concept. And I think if you look at it, I mean, I don't know every single case, but if you look at it on the merits and what I know, what you may know as well, it seems to me that that the measure of proportionality has probably been met in most cases. There could be a discussion in some cases. So therefore, your country is entitled to defend itself against a rocket launcher, and the fact there are civilians there does not mean you can't hit that target. Now, in practice, I know that the IDF go much further than that and very often abort missions if there's a chance of civilian death, but that's not legally required. Legally, you're allowed to hit it. A couple of other things. If you direct an attack directly against a civilian target, there are no military targets or anything, that is obviously a war crime. So you see a bunch of kids milling around and you fire a missile into it, that you are committing a war crime if it's deliberate. You know they're kids. The second area is accidents. 4 boys on a beach. I believe they were shelled or something by an Israeli warship. They're dead. A war crime? I don't know. Probably not, because I would be very surprised if they were engaged on deliberately. I would suspect that that was an accident, and an accident is not a war crime. So there are various categories of events, but I think from what I have been able to see so far, my judgment, having been in this position, I've been in a position where I've had to make judgment calls on whether I attack something or don't attack it. My judgment is that Israel has not been committing war crimes. Look at Hamas. Hamas have been firing missiles at civilian targets indiscriminately. That is a war crime. There's no question about it. There's no argument. That's what's happening. It's also, I mean, you could say, I suppose, I don't know if it would stand up, but you could say that is collective punishment. Sending people scurrying into their air raid shelters, putting kids in fear of their life, terrifying people, disrupting their work. That's collective punishment. That's Hamas punishing the population of Israel. But it's certainly a war crime. They've targeted an international airport and they've targeted nuclear facilities. Those are also war crimes. They have used human shields. They've deliberately put people around their weapons, deliberately tried to get your forces to kill them. It's win-win for them. On the one hand, you see civilians around a military target, you don't attack. They've saved that military target, it can be used again. But they would prefer, in my judgment, they would prefer that you did attack it, because it gives them more propaganda on the international stage. It's what I think Professor Alan Dershowitz referred to as the dead baby strategy, which is not common, not unique to Hamas by any means. It's used by many different groups, including, of course, the Taliban in Afghanistan, who are desperate to get our forces to kill their kids. They've attempted to kidnap civilians. They've attempted to send people through their tunnels, and the tunnels equipped with drugs, handcuffs, so they can kidnap, capture, bind civilians, and to massacre civilians as well. They have breached a humanitarian ceasefire agreed by the parties, agreed by the Red Cross. They've breached that ceasefire. It is a war crime. They also used child soldiers. Now, I don't believe I'm right. I don't believe that's specifically a war crime, but it is certainly something that is, generally, I think, by the international community is believed to be a bad thing, and but hasn't really been commented on or highlighted. One thing I would say is there's an organization called childsoldiersinternational.org, and they highlight cases where children are used to fight wars. Nowhere will you find Hamas in the frame for using child soldiers, but you will find Great Britain in the frame for using child soldiers. We're one of their biggest targets. Do you know why? Because we recruit boys and girls of 16 years old to join the army, and they then do 2 years of academic and military training. And then when they're 18, they can actually join the forces proper. And that's the main concern, one of the main concerns of Child Soldiers International. The question of, I just wanted to mention briefly, incitement. Now, you may think I'm being a bit strong here, but I would say that President Obama, Prime Minister Cameron, Ban Ki-moon, I always get him and that other chap mixed up, Kofi Annan. Ban Ki-moon, Kofi Annan was in my day. Clegg, our Deputy Prime Minister, you've never heard of him, David Miliband, the Leader of Opposition, who said recently that I cannot possibly support this horrendous activity by Israel. These people, and of course the EU because I think the Jerusalem Post published an article saying how great the EU was, condemning Hamas, but you didn't read the next bit of it where it really had a good go at Israel, so that was the most important thing for them. And the United Nations Human Rights Council with their recent ridiculous resolution. All of these people are playing into the hands of Hamas, because Hamas, of course, by their dead baby strategy, as Dershowitz would call it, what they want, they use that in order to incite hatred against Israel and bring pressure down on Israel. And that we've seen rallies in London, in Paris, in other countries over the weekend. That was all about incitement of hatred against Israel. There was not anything comparable to that, despite 160,000 deaths in Syria. But there was in relation to this conflict. And that's nothing to, in my view, there are, of course, very good people marching who are very worried about children and men and women getting killed. But the whole thing was orchestrated in order to provide anti-Israel sentiment. And that's reflected, the pressure, the public pressure, is reflected in the statements by these leaders as well. And what it does, it validates Hamas's policy. It shows Hamas's policy is working, because Hamas's policy of getting Israel to kill people, kill the innocent people, causes this outrage and causes pressure to be brought to bear and causes hatred of Israel, which is what they want. So the more these people play into the hands, fine, criticize Israel if it's justified, but this is not justified the way criticism is happening. So what they do, the effect of it is, by criticizing Israel in this way, they validate Hamas's policy, they encourage Hamas to carry on doing the same thing, they encourage jihadists everywhere to use that same method of attacking people, the West, because non-Western countries very often don't care about human shields anyway. But the outcome of it all is that more innocent people die, because the more human shields get used, the more people will die. So in a way, by the President, the Prime Minister, the Secretary General, by their strong and unjustified criticism of Israel, they are encouraging the death of more innocent civilians. Moral equivalence. I'm often asked, you seem to be siding with Israel over this. You're not balanced. You're not giving an equal judgment. And my response to that is, I'm discussing a conflict between a prescribed terrorist organization, designated as such by the EU, the US, Canada, Israel, and other countries, and a Western liberal democracy. So it's not a question of taking sides. One is a terrorist group trying to attack and kill people in a Western liberal democracy. It's not sides. It's just reality. That's the way it is. I mean, how can you possibly side with the terrorist group? I think the final point I'll make is just one that's often overlooked or ignored, is the effect that all this has on our soldiers. And there are a number of issues here, one of which is by restricting our troops as to what they can do on the ground when they are confronted with an enemy, that endangers them more than they need to be endangered. So in other words, if they are going to attack a position, a house or something like that, and they maybe get told, don't go in firing, which you normally would do, because there might be civilians there, then potentially that leaves them open to being attacked and killed themselves. So it puts their life in danger. We do the same in Afghanistan everywhere. We do exactly the same. We put our soldiers' lives in greater danger than they need otherwise be in order to protect the lives of civilians. That is the right thing to do. But it's a tough judgment. Sometimes you can go too far, and you can put the troops in too great a danger, and the commanders have to make an assessment as to which way it goes. But it's something that very few people consider, actually. And another one in terms of effect on troops. I was having a conversation the other day with some pilots who were flying into Gaza, in and out of Gaza. And one of them said to me this morning, I flew 17 missions, I flew a number of missions, of which 17 or something, that may not be the exact figure, but it was something like that, were aborted because there were civilians in the target area that we were trying to engage. And eventually the whole thing was called off because we never got rid of the civilians. They were always there. And I said to him, you must have found that very frustrating, didn't you? And he said, I didn't find it at all frustrating. He said, I was very pleased. He said, I would much rather spend every day aborting missions than have the blood of innocent people on my hands. And I would much rather continue to call things off than drop a bomb and it kills people who I should not be killing. I could never live with myself again if I did that, if I knew I did that. And I think that's, inevitably there are pilots who have killed innocent people and they do know it. So you have to think about the impact and the effect on those individuals, on this monstrous campaign that Hamas has imposed, not just on the civilian population, but is imposing on the soldiers as well who have to fight them. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. I think we could have all listened for another hour. When Colonel Kemp mentioned all of his honors, and in quotes, there was one honor that he might have mentioned, I'm glad he did in that context, that he's a very important member of the NGO Monitor International Advisory Board, and we thank him for being definitely one of the most important international advisors in this attempt to prevent the total destruction of human rights for these very cynical political objectives. We were talking earlier, and we're talking about the creation of a new Goldstone Commission, and the question of whether Colonel Kemp would be invited. You know, they found Richard Goldstone. It was largely attributed to Kenneth Roth, who's a Israel-obsessed head of an organization with a budget of somewhere between $40 and $50 million a year called Human Rights Watch, which has done tremendous damage to the cause which it claims to support human rights. And if you even look at his tweets, you'll see how obsessed he is with hating Israel. He was the one who basically convinced Judge Goldstone to accept that position of running what's called the Goldstone Commission, and I think did a tremendous wrong to Judge Goldstone by convincing him to do that. If the first Goldstone report was a tragedy, the second one is a farce, is going to be a farce, and probably they're both tragedies and farces. And see who they find to run that. The next speaker who's honored us with his presence is a friend, someone who I've known and colleague for 30 years. We go back that long, Dore. A lot of different points along the way. NGO Monitor started, I think the first conversation I had with anybody before we even had a name for what became NGO Monitor was with Dore and with our founding donor, Harry Wexler, in the end of 2001. It was in a period where there were lots of militant activities by Palestinian militants, suicide bombings, homicide bombings. And we were sitting in the King David Hotel. I think Harry was the only guest at the time who came, and I think it was December 2001. Dore understood right away that having a focus, having an organization, having a framework, as well as an organization, to analyze, to respond to provide some checks and balances to this human rights war that was going on, even back then, he understood that. He's had a very distinguished and continues to have a very distinguished career as foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu and then ambassador of Israel to the United Nations between 1997 and 1999. Very prolific writer, author, researcher, 5 books, including, I think, the most important book on the United Nations, one of the few serious books a book on Jerusalem, the research report on defensible borders, which I think changed the vocabulary, the understanding of the way that Israel was, the negotiations for borders were understood and the importance of territory, and many very other accomplishments, including current president of the Jerusalem Center of Public Affairs. Dore, I know that you're extremely busy, and I thank you for taking time off to join us today.
The phone always rings when it shouldn't. Gerald, it's a real pleasure to be here today, and you're right. A long time ago, I agreed with you in identifying NGOs as a whole category in international affairs that had not been examined but were causing huge damage because there was nobody watching the NGOs. There was nobody monitoring what they were doing. And you opened up a whole new field, and it's been an extraordinary contribution to the state of Israel. And I have to say something, Colonel Kemp, your involvement just to seek truth has been so important. I will never forget watching your appearance at the UN Human Rights Council, which we all saw as like this moment in which the sun was shining, in which truth was coming out. And to see you identify yourself in terms of your military experience, and then to make a judgment to Israel that, in fact, we had the most moral army fighting today in the world was a powerful input. You know, one of the things that happens to countries that get hammered all the time in international bodies, and even if those bodies are corrupt, is it affects the it affects the self-assurance of a nation over time, which is why they do it. It affects the self-assurance of a nation. People go, you know, maybe we are really bad. Maybe we really are engaging in these horrible, unspeakable crimes. And then a person with your authority and your gravitas says, no, that's wrong. It's so important, and just even last night watching you on Channel 2, you know, we're now getting hit again by the same Goldstone phenomenon, and that's why I wanted to really thank you for what you're doing and acknowledge the importance of it. I'm not going to speak very long, but I'll try and make some points to you on the basis of my experience in this area. Not everybody recalls, since the point of departure is the Goldstone report. In November of 2009, I received a phone call from Brandeis University. And the phone call was somewhat odd, but the gentleman on the other side, I don't want to identify, is an Israeli who was actually serving at Brandeis at the time. And he said, Dore, we're having Justice Richard Goldstone, the author of the famous report, come to Brandeis University to speak. And we thought it would be appropriate that you would deliver the response. In effect, you would debate him. So, I mean, I heard this challenge being thrown in front of me, this gauntlet, and I wondered whether I should do it. I did a quick calculation, and I looked at my watch, and I had about 2.5 weeks to prepare from the phone call till 0 hour, when I would have to appear. So first I said yes, and then I quickly devised a strategy of how to handle this. Clearly, Richard Goldstone is one of the leading legal minds in international law, in humanitarian law. I have a number of his books and articles in my library, and I knew that if I was going to deal with this report by getting into a legal battle with Goldstone at Brandeis, I would be going into territory where my strengths would not be expressed, to put it mildly. What I immediately understood back then, and this is relevant for today, was that I could win this if I could present the facts of the case. Not the law, the facts of the case. And I was very lucky to have assistance from Prime Minister Netanyahu's office, because basically the top leadership, I don't want to identify the officers, of the general staff of the IDF, opened up the books for me. I never use a PowerPoint. I don't know, PowerPoints remind me of, conferences on missile defense we used to go to in the 80s with SDI, and showing the Scud and the interceptor and the architecture for the missile defense. I just felt that's not the way to go. But this time, I did a PowerPoint. I had the assistance of a very talented graphic artist who was a reserve soldier in the IDF spokesman's office, and we put together a presentation. I want to go into that for a minute because there are features of the old Goldstone report that will again recur in whatever report yesterday's UN human rights resolution generates. The Goldstone report was over 500 pages. And if you don't understand the importance of an NGO Monitor, by the way, you just got to look at the footnotes. An academic, I always have to look at the footnotes. And you see in those footnotes one NGO after another supporting the conclusions of the Goldstone report. And it's the same group, it's the same characters. But there was one there that I was particularly interested in. We have an excellent Middle East expert at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, Yonatan Dechoach-Halevi, who was a contrarian in the 1990s about the Oslo agreements and therefore had a difficult time in our intelligence corps. But then he won the prize of the Chief of Staff for telling the truth from Mofaz. Anyway, I brought in Yoni to help me with all the Arabic that was required for this enterprise of preparing for the Goldstone debate. And one of the things in those footnotes was a recurring organization called Tawthiq, T-A-W-T-H-I-Q. Now, Tawthiq in Arabic means documentation. So what is this documentation NGO? Well, apparently, Hamas, when we think of Hamas, we think of a terrorist organization, which it is. Hamas set up a legal division. And their responsibility was to gather documentation to finger Israel. And Tawthiq sent material to Geneva to the Goldstone group as they were planning. It shows the sophistication of our adversary. By the way, in the days when many European countries were advancing the doctrine of universal jurisdiction. That means that cases could be brought to their courts even though they involved events that weren't in their territory with people who weren't nationals of their country, like the efforts to try and grab Israeli officers when they landed in London. Tawthik was behind the Paragod, providing a lot of this material. So in reviewing the report, I identified a number of central weak points in the arguments that the Goldstone Group had put together. And I'm not going to go through this now, but I will point out a few of them. And I think one of the underlying weaknesses was who ordered the report. Where did this report come from? Well, you know, was it just created out of nothing? No, it was created out of the UN Human Rights Council, the same body that passed a resolution to do another investigation yesterday. Now, here in Israel, we sort of get all misty-eyed when we hear the word UN, because many people incorrectly assume that the UN created the State of Israel. You know, we all remember those black and white movies from 1947 where they go through all the countries, Albania, or, you know, whatever, Afghanistan, no, you know. And then finally the requisite number of countries to support the creation of a Jewish state. That requisite number was reached, and suddenly people are dancing in Tel Aviv in those old black and white movies, and it's, you know, it connects the creation of Israel with the UN. Now, it is true that UN General Assembly Resolution 181 was a moral force. It was an encouragement from the world community that it was legitimate for the Jews to recreate their ancient homeland as a state. But in fact, what created the State of Israel was when in May of 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared independence for the State of Israel in Tel Aviv. The legal act done by the General Assembly, which doesn't have the power to create international law, it can make recommendations, that whatever act was done in 1947 didn't change the status of the territory here. What changed the status of the territory was when Ben-Gurion declared independence. So I say we get misty-eyed because we misinterpret our own history many times, and we think anything with the UN on it relates to our very existence. But the UN Human Rights Council, which, as most of you know, does not sit in New York City, but in Geneva. The UN Human Rights Council was a kind of newly born UN body. There had been a Human Rights Commission, which had been so bad, so distorting, so lacking credibility, that the UN had to close it down. So they closed down the UN Human Rights Commission, and then they create a UN Human Rights Council. Now, the Human Rights Council was established in 2006, not in 1945. And the Human Rights Council, which again gives birth to the Goldstone Report, in its first year of operation was criticized not by NGO Monitor, but by Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations. And what did Kofi Annan say in 2006 about the Human Rights Council? He said, since the beginning of their work, they have focused almost entirely on Israel. And there are other crisis situations like Sudan, where they have not been able to say a word. Now, since then, we've had Darfur and a few other things. But nonetheless, this was the sentiment of the Secretary General of the United Nations, rejecting the body he created. And it is that body which voted in 2009, early 2009, to create the Goldstone Commission, to investigate Israel. So now as then, the Human Rights Council was the instrumental body to make this happen. But if that was the judgment of Kofi Annan about this body, then how can we give it such moral weight? Why should we get all worked up when the Human Rights Council issues anything? Why should it be a high-level item in our radio news in the morning? Serious questions. But in any event, it created the Goldstone panel. And one of the features of the Goldstone panel that most struck me, feature number one, that relates also to today, if you're creating a fact-finding mission, and the fact-finding mission is supposed to go to the area where the war took place and reach some conclusions. International humanitarian law was violated. Human rights were compromised. Don't you think that when you order the panel to be created, you don't put the conclusions of the report in the question? Am I clear? But that is exactly what the Human Rights Council did back in 2009, and it is exactly what the Human Rights Council is doing again. We are forming a special commission to see if you beat your sister. And then we're going to send a group to investigate whether the beating took place. But you've already put out this big conclusion in the question that you've asked. That is how the UN operated then and how it's operating today. The second issue has to do with the central argument of the report. The report asserted back then that Israel deliberately killed civilians in Operation Cast Lead. Not accidentally, not making a mistake, deliberately, as a matter of policy. Now, of course, and I'm not going through it because we don't have much time in any case, everyone knows the whole multiple warning system that the IDF provides to civilians. Leaflets, breaking into radio transmissions, telephone calls, cell phone calls, text messages in Arabic, a special unit to conduct all this work. So if you're going through the effort and the expense to set up special Arabic units to warn people, then how can you have a policy of deliberately attacking civilians? This was the worst accusation made against the state of Israel in that whole Goldstone effort. It just doesn't make sense. But nonetheless, that was what was asserted. And by the way, when Justice Goldstone finally wrote his Washington Post article in 2011, basically recanting on the Goldstone report, the specific conclusion that doesn't hold water is the accusation that Israel deliberately killed civilians. We should be aware of that because that's going to come back. Now I'm going to try and bring this to a conclusion because we are sort of running low on time. And if you're describing a 500-page report, you'll get out of here at 11 p.m. next week. But there are so many things. You know, Colonel Kemp mentioned Colonel Desmond Travers, one of my favorite figures in the Goldstone effort. And I also recall that Colonel Travers made some comments that it's impossible that mosques, which is raised in the Goldstone report, were used to store weapons. And therefore, if Israel hit a mosque, it was hitting a place of faith, not a place where weapons are stored. Desmond Travers, whatever his military experience actually was, he also presented himself as an expert on Islam. And he made the following statement in a very revealing interview. He said, "We found no evidence that mosques were used to store munitions. Those charges reflect Western perceptions in some quarters that Islam is a violent religion." So if you say that when I was in Afghanistan or I was in Fallujah in Iraq and I found 60 mosques with weapons in them, which is what the US Army found in Fallujah in Iraq, then you're an Islamophobe. You're not reporting accurate information. You have a predisposition that's wrong. That's what Travers is especially hinting, which shows you that one of the problems we faced then with the Goldstone report, and we will face with the next effort to write a report, is that many of the conclusions are derived from ideology, not from hard work. I think there was a British colonel named Tim Collins, who went for the BBC into mosques that were attacked by Israel. And he pointed out secondary explosives, which means that the mosque had explosive materials in them. And yet, and as a result, when they were hit from the air, all the dynamite, the TNT that was in the mosque went off. And he could see, and he said that on the BBC. I think Travers said something, "Oh, I know Tim Collins, but you know, he doesn't always get it right." It was some kind of dismissive. So we have a new Goldstone report being planned. I want to say something, and with this I'll conclude. You know, I've been thinking about the strategy of Hamas. Hamas is dealing with a very strong and professional Israeli army. And yet Hamas is refusing to ceasefire. It's rather remarkable. Israel apparently indicated to various international intermediaries 3 times last week that it would accept a ceasefire. But Hamas, no. You'd think they were really winning the war for the way they're behaving. But Hamas is not looking at this as a battlefield. Hamas is looking at this as a political struggle, and they're willing to sacrifice Palestinian children and Palestinian civilians to win that political struggle. Because as the war is prolonged, and Hamas is prolonging this war, reminds me of the Iranians in the Iran-Iraq war. It could have been finished in 1983 when they recovered all their lost territory that Saddam took, but they kept it going. Well, Hamas is doing the same thing. They're keeping it going. Because as the war gets longer, several things happen. Casualties on the Palestinian side mount up. That goes on television. That builds sympathy. And who is the great ally of Hamas in the Arab world? Nobody, except one country, Arab world, I didn't say Iran. Qatar. And what is Qatar's national strategic asset? Al Jazeera. So as people die in Gaza, Al Jazeera covers it, tries to incite the population in the Arab world, forcing Arab leaders to change their position and support Hamas, all in the name of politics, not in the name of anything else. So in my judgment, what is occurring now in this conflict, and it isn't much different than previous ones, is that Hamas is playing political football with the lives of their own people, and they'd be doing a lot more against the lives of our people if we didn't have the defensive systems and the civil defense that we've put in place. And tragically, we're forced to sacrifice the lives of brave IDF soldiers while Hamas is involved in this travesty. Let's hope that some in the international community will have the wisdom to see through this. But on the basis of what happened with Goldstone back in 2009, I'm not sure that's going to happen.
Our first speaker is a retired colonel, and our last speaker is a retired colonel. in the Israeli military, with an outstanding career in Israeli military intelligence when she retired in 2004, but she didn't really retire. She's still going strong. Colonel Miri Eisin was first seen by many of us as the Israeli government spokeswoman or spokesperson during the 2006 Lebanon War, also the Prime Minister's international and media advisor. Can I say Miri? I'll say it on a personal basis. Was one of the first members of the Israeli establishment that I saw, that I met, that I know, that understood soft power, understood the impact of, and the way in which to try to deal with that impact of television, of social media later. You know, the Israeli IDF spokesperson usually is someone, still now today, you see the IDF spokesperson and he is always wearing a uniform and usually with a rifle. And when you're trying to explain to the rest of the world, which sees soldiers as something very unusual in the United States, maybe a little less, and in Europe and elsewhere, the audience doesn't listen anymore. To have someone who is capable of addressing these very complicated issues and presenting them in the language and the framework of soft power, that's a very important asset. That's as important as any other asset we don't have enough of. And again, I'm honored and pleased that Miri Eisin accepted the invitation and is prepared to speak to us now from her experience. Thank you, Miri.
It's kind of like, you know, the 30, 20, 10, right? Okay, first 30 and then 20, and now I get 10, and that's fine. And what I want to do is I want to go back to my military background. And some of you have also in the past read what I have written about war perception and perception warfare, but I want to remind us right now of the dimensions of war. When we talk about the dimensions of war, when I talk about the last 17 days and of this operation and of this time, this round with the Gaza Strip, and I'll talk about that in a moment, when we talk about dimensions of war, most of us immediately go into the very strict military aspects. We're talking right now aerial campaign, sea campaign, land campaign, and the new favorite buzzword that we all have right now is not land, but underground. But when you're talking about the dimensions of war, certainly over the last 10, 15 years, and to a large degree for much longer than that, and I'm going to talk for a moment also in historical perspective, certainly Israel, but not only Israel, are involved in additional dimensions of warfare itself. Meaning it's not just about the aerial dimension, it's not just about the sea, the land, and the underground. There's also the one that we all love so much right now, the cyber warfare, and that's a whole other dimension. But I want to talk here entirely about the type that I call perception warfare. Because there is a military action that's taking place. And that military action that all of us are living through right now, that we're kind of as if watching on TV, because you're all aware of the fact that none of us are seeing it. What we're seeing is the perception dimension. We're seeing what's being shown. We're seeing what each side puts out. And I kind of feel, and I thought about this before as the speakers before me were also talking, that I am in a Monty Python moment. And I say that because I know that many of the audience have to be, you know, with British backgrounds, and you're going to have your Monty Pythons, because I am not going to talk in the same terms, and I kind of feel that I'm going to be the woman in Life of Brian who's going to be stoned in a few minutes, and so I want everybody to take a little bit of yoga breaths as I start talking about these dimensions of perceptions. Because when we're talking about the perceptions, and again, I am talking within war and about perceptions, and we're standing here and talking about what looks like it's about to be, which is that second Goldstone. By the way, it won't be Goldstone, so we have to make up the term, because we shouldn't be calling it that. We should invent the new term in that sense for it. I thought for a moment we could call it the Richard Falk, because I have a feeling he's going to be the one who's going to be called up to chair it, right? Im kvar az kvar in my Israeli terms. But we have to think in the terms of the perception and what's being built right now in the perception arena beyond the actual facts, as Dore was talking about before, of what's happening in the military arena. But what I'm saying is that the perception arena is part of the military arena. It is part of the warfare that we lead in today's 21st century wars. So I want to go backwards and forwards. The state of Israel has fought many wars. And from 1982, the wars that we have fought have been wars of Israel as a state actor against non-state actors. And when you fight as an independent state, as a state actor, you are accountable, you are responsible, you are in all of these international community different things. You have diplomatic relations, and you are held both as accountable and as responsible, and you feel so also as to yourself. And from 1982, the first Lebanon War, and I'm using terms here both of operations and war, but the first Lebanon War, the first Intifada, I got to go forward in time, right? I'm like with my 1987. I go onwards in time to the second Intifada, the second Lebanon War, the Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense, and right now, okay, all of these different larger scale, and there were smaller ones also in the Lebanese arena. All of them were of Israel fighting against non-state actors, and I state that here because in the perception warfare, and now's the stage where everybody needs to start taking those yoga breaths, ladies and gentlemen, the issue of perception is central. Because in the issue of perception, in the world, is the yoga stage, please, everybody? This isn't about Israel against the Hamas. It's about Israel against the Gaza Strip. That's what it's called everywhere. And by the way, also, in Israel, it's not called on Israeli TV, and this perception issue is everywhere. It's not called Israel against the Hamas. On all of the Israeli channels, it's called the operation in Gaza. Now, Gaza is not just the Hamas. Gaza is people too. And I want to state again here, and we said this before, this isn't just about the 4 children that were erroneously killed by the Israeli. And by the way, Richard, what they understand that it is right now is that it was airplanes that made a mistake. And as you said, a mistake is not a war crime. But in the perception warfare, 4 children being killed 100 meters from 17 different TV media units who were there immediately, that immediately becomes part of the different elements of warfare, not just of incitement and of what it shows, and giving them morale, and also bringing the wrath of public opinion, and in that sense, and together with the public opinion, the butts of the international leaders. I have to say that, again, with my own background perspective, not in perception warfare, but in perspective, we're on the 17th day of this operation, and I have the perspective personally, certainly of 1982. I was a young officer, so that's a long time ago. But of the second Intifada, when I stood up as the spokesperson, in the second Lebanon War, where I was the government spokesperson, in 2008-9, when I was a government spokesperson, that this time the international community, and here I do think that there has been a different type of balance, have actually at least first stated that we have the right to defend ourselves and then said the but. It isn't always both of them there, and it's not enough for everybody sitting here in the audience, because everybody here wants to talk, and these are terms that before Ambassador Gold mentioned, of right and wrong. And many of you have heard me before, and you know that when I talk about the media, and this is that yoga moment again, ladies and gentlemen, it isn't about right and wrong. It's about perception. And you can stand up from here to eternity and say, I'm right, and they're wrong, and they're going to stand up and say, they're wrong, and we're right, and then it's going to be this whole battle of right and wrong. But what stays in people's minds, in the perceptions, is the picture that is worth 1,000 words. The picture that changed this operation, and I can give you basically the picture that changed 1982. It's that stage, as I said, this isn't a nice thing. It isn't easy, but it's part of warfare, and it's something that you have to acknowledge, and then you can assess it, and then you can try and do something with it. Because if you think that it's just a question of right and wrong and they're going to get it, then not only is it going to be Goldstone, UN Watch, etc., number 2 or number 3. It's going to be the wrath of the world against Israel, and I think that there are things that we can do in perception warfare, and I think that many of them have been implemented in this operation, and that because of that, we are in a different situation. This is the first war where every single Israeli unit that is fighting inside the Gaza Strip has, as a fighter, a man holding a gun and a camera. And that we did not have in the past. And that means that we do acknowledge the fact that we have to bring the evidence, that it isn't just about that. In that perception warfare, you can't just say, I didn't mean to do so. You can't just say that it was that they're telling stories, that they're putting together all of the Photoshop and everything else out. And again, I take a deep breath and I say, ladies and gentlemen, 700 people were killed. Now, when it came to Operation Cast Lead, 1,400 people were killed. And when it came out afterwards, we constantly were sitting and talking about, okay, out of those 1,400 people, how many at the end were militants? And I want us to be clear, probably 200. Less? More? You want? No, we never. Listen, I have the list of names, okay? So there was what we assessed, and then there's the list of names, and I don't think that at the end they can, all right, you know what? It was 700. 700 citizens, civilians. And I say that because in this war of perception, the second stage after the issue of perception is the issue of framing. And what do I mean when I talk about framing? The framing of Israel is ours. This is all about us. This is about us defending ourselves. This is about a framing that it depends where you stop. And again, I feel with my deep breath as I'm about to say things that I know are not something which are easy within any group to say. But in the Israeli framing, when we talk about the Gaza Strip in 2014 and in 2012, and in the Mavi Mara of 2010, and in 2008-9 of Operation Cast Lead, I keep going backwards. For us, we essentially start from the event that I'm going to call here in the official government name, so please no yelling names at me right now, of the disengagement of 2005, and we start from there. That's where we frame it. But the international community don't frame it at all in the same way. When they talk about the issue of the Gaza Strip, and again, because it's even Israel frames it and talks about this in the perception as the operation in Gaza. And they talk about the Gaza Strip in different terms. Again, in the perception warfare of this event, there has actually been, in most of the, not all the international media, certainly not the Arab media, but in general, a separation of Hamas from the population. To me, that's like, wow, that's a good thing. That's the first time that they've actually done that type of separation where they are acknowledging that Hamas is the terrorist organization, is firing out the rockets, is using them as human shields, but then they focus on the civilians. And when they talk about the civilians, not about Hamas, this is about the civilians, the terms that they're using is mainly terms of victimhood. And I state that here because I want to end in that sense on this issue of perceptions about this aspect of victims. So I don't remember where the conversation was going on before and if it was something that you said before also, Gerald, in that sense, but it's something that goes on all the time when we talk about how we project ourselves. Right now, inside Israel, when I talk, and many of you have seen, I've been doing an enormous amount of Israeli media in this one, I talk about the difference also between feeling strong and feeling safe. I feel that the state of Israel over the last 17 days is being enormously strong, but that doesn't mean that every single one of us feels safe all of the time. Okay? We're here in Jerusalem. I live in what I call the alarm area. It's very nice now. You suddenly come to Jerusalem. It's a safe spot, right? And when I go down into there, I have 3 kids. My kids are most definitely in that stage of the impact of what the sirens do. But in the picture and in the frame, my kids are sitting at home, and when there's an alarm, they go to the safe spot, and then the alarm is over, and they go back in. What is the end result? That to a certain degree in Israel, over the last 17 days, and excuse me for being so rude, but I want to talk about this in perception, the 3 people who were killed, where were they? They were outside. Don't they know better? Now, one of them was going to bring things to soldiers. He's such a wonderful soul. He was killed by a mortar. Why was he outside? Okay. Second one is a Bedouin who lives inside an illegal structure out there in the Negev. They don't have sirens and they don't have, it's like, wow, you know, like, how can we take care of everything? The third one, a worker, a foreign worker who was working outside again in that area around the Gaza Strip, but everybody else, there's a siren, we know what to do. In this perception warfare, when we try to do the aspects of looking at us from the outside in, and we talk about the victims, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think that we have victims. I'm very proud of that. I don't want to be in a place that has victims. There are victims of terror, of course, there are victims on all sides, but the soldiers being killed on the Israeli side are not victims. I don't think of them that way. They are the best, and they are doing what they need to do to defend the state of Israel. That's not a victim. And when I talk about victims, and here's that stage where I need to take the deep breath because it's a very hard step for all of us to do, that framing of the international community, which is so impacting the British foreign minister, all of the different ones, that issue of the Gazan people, not the Hamas, but the Gazan people being victims. And again, it's like, is that the victims are not accountable. Hamas, and that's a distinction this time in this perception warfare that Israel has been emphasizing from A to Z at every stage along the way, Hamas is accountable. But if we don't do for ourselves that distinction between Hamas and the Gazan people, and we talk about Gaza and the problems, and it's always in that framing of Gaza, then in the international world's perception looking at it Israel is blaming the victim. Not only are they victims, Israel is blaming the victim. And from that point, where we are viewed in any case in the world as a militaristic, strong country that knows how to defend its own, and what? You invested so much money in defending your own, and yet you attack poor victims. And I'm stating that here because that framing is the one that's going to be with us this time too. I think that there actually is a lot that has been done this time different from the past on the issue of the report. I actually think in that sense that in the next report, which I don't know if we're not going to let them in again. I don't know what we'll do, because I actually believe, just like you all said here, that once they made that decision at the United Nations yesterday, it's a question of time until the next people come on and in, and it will be a charade. But the question is, can we put out our own report before that happens and not do that responsive that we did last time, where we stand up and say, we would like to show you the world, our perspective. And not to show it in words, not for Miri to stand up and say, we're so good, we're so straight. No. We're going to bring in the cameras from all of these embedded soldiers that have been taking the cameras. And they're not going to be perfect, and it's going to be at the end, again, Israel against the Hamas. But we have to acknowledge, I think, inside Israel, and I actually think that this time we've done so, but it's never comfortable, is to acknowledge that in the world, they are separating right now, and I'm not talking about the ones who think that Hamas are great, okay? I am talking about the fact that in general, there has been a separation between Hamas as the terrorist organization, as embedded within the civilian population, and then there's the civilians. And that aspect is the one which certainly after today, it started with the 4 kids on the shore. I'm going to say something inside this closed room, and this is the point where if this comes out, I'll be devastated, okay? I don't want you to quote this in this term. I'm trying to make a point, okay? I'm very worried about the way that this could be misquoted, so I have to think about this one for a moment, okay? When I saw the 4 kids that were killed, and I thought, oh my God, we made such a mistake, and then to my mind came the following thought, okay? Because I live in Tel Aviv, right? My kids have not gone to the beach for the last 17 days, okay? And it was a terrible thing. I thought as a mother, okay, there's this conflict going on, and there's no safe zone, and it's the summer, and I live in Tel Aviv, okay? My kids live on the beach in the summer and in the winter. And as that went through my mind, I thought, wow, it just goes to show how much they believe in our own capability and how much they think that we actually know how to pinpoint it, that you could even do such a thing. Having said that, I take it, because at the end, 4 kids were killed. And I want every single, and that, because that was where the international media and that perception aspect started to take the turning point. I've seen this in the past, the Second Intifada, we mistreated media-wise from the beginning, but in the Second Lebanon War, there was a very specific trigger where the media started to change. Same goes for Kass-Led, and so on. And I think right now we've passed that point. We're all going to abhor the international media because from that moment, not just of the 700 number, but today there were more civilians in a large group that were killed. That's where the media itself is only going to focus on the victims. They may or may not do a separation from the Hamas, and we need to be the ones who preempt, which is what we have not done in the past. And I hope that on this case, as I said, in the dimensions of war, that the military itself is the one that is preparing that perception dimension to be able to bring out our own case, not to the United Nations, but to be able to bring it out so that our allies, I don't believe in this United Nations Council anyways, but that our own allies will believe us. Because I'm more worried by the British Foreign Minister than I am by the United Nations. I am more worried by the Secretary of State of the United States than I am by the United Nations. And I think that we need to prepare this as we did in the Second Intifada, as you need to do, and you need to do it front and preemptive. And I'll end on that note because I took more than my allocated 10 minutes.
We've had an excellent, excellent panel. There's a lot to take home. There's a lot more to be done. And I want to thank everybody, our speakers, for coming. All the people who worked hard to make what was put together very quickly a successful afternoon. Unfortunately, I think we'll probably have to do some more of these. This is not going to end that quickly, but hopefully in less than a couple of 100 years, we'll be able to start implementing some of these issues. So thank you all for coming. Besorot tovot.